introduce our speaker for the day, Mr. Edward Nam. Ed is a member of
Fair Oaks
Presbyterian Church. That just went right out of my mind. And he also works for the EPA and is going to have a second, we're going to have a 201, Environmental Justice 201. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Ed Nam. I'm a deacon at Fair Oaks Presbyterian, and I also work at the Environmental Protection Agency. However, I am here as a citizen and not as an employee of the Environmental Protection Agency, so that I can speak more freely and voice some opinions as well. And so you can ask me whatever you want during the conversation. I am currently the land director in the Chicago office. That means that we implement the land and hazardous waste, solid waste rules for the 6 Great Lakes states from Minnesota to Ohio. Before that, most of my career was in air pollution. So I was the air director for a few years. I actually came from the Ann Arbor office, where we regulated the transportation industry. So I'm actually a car guy. I used to work at Ford Motor Company, and I did the first 2 greenhouse gas fuel economy regulations. And in fact, Fair Oaks Presbyterian is doing an electric vehicle adults ed today, where my EV is parked right out in front. And my wife is doing the outreach on that. So, but I'm here to talk about environmental justice. We'll call it 102 because Reverend Johnson, is that right, Reverend Johnson, did such a great job last week. I watched her on video a few days ago, and she gave a wonderful presentation. Rather than scrambling for a few days to change my slides, I'm just going to skip some slides because she went through some of that material, so we'll be able to get to more 201 material. So, this is an outline. I'm going to talk about a little bit of history, some of the history that maybe Reverend Johnson didn't cover. I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about the legacies of redlining, and actually won't go into what is environmental justice because she showed the EPA definition of environmental justice, so I don't have to do that. I want to talk about a little bit more about redlining because it was such an important part of our history and where we are now. And before there was environmental injustice, there was redlining. And before redlining, there was Jim Crow segregation. And before Jim Crow segregation, there was slavery. So environmental justice is a direct and lasting legacy and another incarnation of institutional racism. And it is still very much in practice today, unfortunately. This is a map of Chicago from 1938 from FHA, Federal Housing Authority. And you see all the red line districts in the south of Chicago and the west. This is probably, if you lived in Chicago for some time, this would not surprise you. This is where the predominantly black neighborhoods were back then. And going to the next slide, before I go to the next slide. This is as I said, this was a map in the FHA guidebook. So this was a government program. Okay, so the United States government was part of this, and I pulled this from the website, and the FHA website, which I'm happy to see, they do have some information about environmental justice and their role in continuing that policy. It's interesting. They have some mea culpa on their website, so it's really nice to see that. Doesn't really talk about, but they have some policies to rectify it as well. But I'm going to talk about the EPA side rather than PUCs and FHA. This is another map of Chicago, and it shows, here it's not in red, but this yellow, greenish yellow area, that's where predominantly black Chicagoans live. And the map on the left is a map of cumulative emissions burden or pollution. And you see that the cumulative pollution that the folks in the south and the west are exposed to are just in historic redline neighborhoods. The same, you can overlap these maps with the map that I had in this prior slide, and you see that industry sources are along this this here. Let me pull up my notes here for a second. That's the Chicago Sanitary Ship Canal that was built to reverse the flow of the Chicago River, and so there was a lot of industry along that corridor. So we see that that red line area goes, never mind that, goes all the way out to the western parts of, southwestern parts of Chicago. And down on the southern part of the map, it goes around Lake Michigan, all the way to Gary, East Chicago. All of those areas have very red environmental justice areas. So this is a picture view from the west side of Chicago, from what used to be a more industrial area. And you see this is the sanitary line, water over there. So Chicago is not alone in this, in redlining. There are approximately 143 cities, over 7,000 neighborhoods, according to the National Geographic Society. It was particularly pronounced in the Northeast and Midwest cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and this is Indianapolis. Again, a map showing redlined area, vacant properties, and the racial dot map area of the makeup today. So it is a lasting legacy of this segregation and redlining. Now, what redlining was, in the 1920s, the restrictive covenant practices had been ongoing. So this was way before Federal Housing Authority began its operations in 1934 during the Depression. The FHA staff concluded that no loan could be economically sound if the property was located in a neighborhood that was or could become populated by black people, as property values might decline over the life of the 15 to 20-year loans. That is a quote. This, so that was from the FHA website. And so I am gonna move on. This is the definition of environmental justice, which Reverend Johnson mentioned last week. This is a kind of a pictorial of how we talk about the difference between equality, equity, and justice. It is a very common picture of, and a simplified version of how we think about the three different concepts. And I'm just going to, since Reverend Johnson talked about that, I'm going to quickly move on. These are some health impacts. She talked about asthma as well, and this is a map that shows a direct comparison. Reverend Johnson talked about EJ screen, so this is an EJ screen map. So the red areas are predominantly people of color, and then the red area on this map is high levels of asthma. And so there is a direct correlation between exposure to pollution and respiratory ailments like asthma. And so this is, we see this time and time again, in city after city after city. And in fact, one of the reasons why I came to Chicago from the Ann Arbor office was because I wanted to work on environmental justice issues. It's a passion of mine, and in headquarters, we don't do a lot of environmental justice work because they're Here's another example of this correlation between formerly redlined areas and, in this case, this is lead. Lead is a legacy pollutant. We don't really emit a lot of lead in our cities anymore, but Chicago had a lot of lead sources. It also had lead gasoline, and we see the legacy pollution of lead in on the let's see, on these plots to the left here. So we see all of the lead concentrations. The darker it is, the more lead there is. And you see on the right the locations of, this is higher, correlating to higher levels of blood lead levels. And so there, again, there is a far higher correlation between historic lead sources and blood lead concentration. And of course, many of you may already know that lead in blood is, causes neurological issues. It may affect IQ. It also affects, it also makes some children violent or erratic. And so this is a significant issue, and one that we are following very closely as well in terms of blood lead levels. These slides, if I can send them to you later, this is the history of environmental justice, and Reverend Johnson gave a very nice history of environmental justice. So I'm going to race on over to environmental justice 201.
Could you back up just one slide?
Yes.
And talk a little bit, if time permits, talk a little bit more about the online courses such as edX and the Berkeley. Just, it doesn't have to be now, but this is something I know we did not discuss last week.
Okay, yes.
Okay,
I can.
thank you.
The Harvard has a lot of really interesting material, including this edX justice course. There's also a very famous Harvard racial profile. I forgot, I should have put that on here, but it's a very commonly used self-test where you can go on and test how progressive you think you really are, and it's really interesting how it is very surprising the kinds of results that you will see on there, and you can Google it with some keywords and find it very quickly.
It's the implicit association test.
Susan?
The implicit association test.
That is it. Thank you.
Wait, would you repeat?
The implicit association test, thank you. So if you plug in those keywords under Harvard, it is internationally acclaimed. It's one of the best tests out there, and I was surprised, and I think many of you will be as well, how it paints a really good picture of some of the weaknesses that we all have in terms of our implicit biases that come into our everyday lives and decisions.
Thank you.
There is a number of other videos and sources online. This is just a small sample of them.
Okay.
And I'll get these slides to later. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time about 201 issues, some of the issues that Reverend Johnson didn't have a chance to get into. I'm sure she knows a lot about these. She did talk about general iron, so I'm going to just quickly cover that. But I wanted to spend some time talking about environmental law 101. And then I'll spend the end talking about what can we do as citizens, on top of some of the things that Reverend Johnson mentioned. So you'll understand why I want to talk about environmental law 101 in a couple of minutes. But bear with me, please, for a moment. As an EPA regulator, we don't write laws. Congress passes laws, which requires the executive branch to set regulations be the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is for waste, and it may be the CERCLA Act, which is the Superfund Act. So there's a number of acts where we get the authority to set regulations. Those regulations are set based on risk-based health or exposure standards. And so how do we do that? We we model a source and a receptor. A receptor is us, a person, a human being. It could be an adult or a child. It could also be a pregnant mother. It could also be something in the ecology, an animal or a plant. The source is, of course, a pollution source. And so you have a source and you have a receptor. And you determine what the exposure is to that receptor and whether that exposure is at a level, you set the emissions at a level from the source so that the receptor is minimally harmed. And there is no such thing as zero harm because we live in an industrial society. The saying goes, everything causes cancer. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but there are, you can't get down to zero. And that's literally an impossibility. Even though we do say there is no safe level of lead, there is no safe level of mercury, it is something that is in our society. There are background levels of lead. Mercury is not so much that much background level, but there are background levels of lead, and so we set the standard so that it meets about background level, and that's about as low as we can't get. We can't get to zero. So we look at technical feasibility. In other words, are there technologies that can reduce the pollution, and how much does it cost, and what the company is out of business. So we do think about the costs and benefits of the rules. We have to, this is kind of a difficult subject to talk to the public about, but we do set regulations in a manner that does not destroy the economy of this country. And so that is, it's part of our mandate, even though there are times when such levels may result in some exposure that we believe is below health, the limit of what is safe for health. However, it is not so far down that that it's close to zero. So we will talk about what are the ramifications of that in a slide or two. So once those regulations are set, the states and territories implement those regulations, including my office. The environmental controls implicitly assume, as I mentioned, that in our industrial society we cannot reduce this to zero. And so sources are permitted. These are called permits. They are permitted to operate as long as they emit pollution below whatever those standards are. And we have in the past typically managed environmental justice concerns through oversight and enforcement. And there's a lot of cheating out there, especially environmental justice areas. And it has resulted in a lot of emission reductions for EPA areas. And Region 5, I'm proud to say, has some of the most aggressive enforcement in the country. So, next. So what happens if the exposure is high, yet all sources are compliant? This is what I mentioned earlier. All the sources are permitted to operate, but there are many sources. So let's say, for example, you set a regulation for a source and receptor. That regulation determines that that level of emissions is safe for that receptor. But let's say you put another source on the other side of that receptor. And let's say you put another source on the north and another source to the south. Now you have 4 sources, and you have a receptor, but 4 sources of emissions. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the authority to ratchet down the emissions from all 4 of those sources because we set the standard for a single source. If you think about it, why can't we do that? If you think about it, if a source starts business in this neighborhood and emits at a level where they think is appropriate, and somehow there's 10 other sources that are allowed to operate in that neighborhood, that first source was operating legally. The second source maybe was operating legally and meeting health standards, but then the rest of everyone else may be piling on. But what about the sources that are in some other city? So there would be an issue with competitiveness for those companies and those industries, and the EPA does not have the power to set winners and losers. So if U.S. Steel is in this industry, is in this neighborhood, and it's in another neighborhood, and it's emitting a permanent facility here, but it is contributing to dangerous levels of lead or whatever metals, but in this other neighborhood it's not, but they're both permitted to operate, we can't make this one operate at half the emissions at that moment, because maybe this is a competitor steel company and you don't want to necessarily put this company out of business. And so Congress did not give us that authority. This is what we call cumulative emissions, and it is one of the problems to solve in the Environmental Protection Agency. So disproportionate exposures can occur from cumulative impact of many legally polluting sources. And we don't usually, I don't want to get into fine print here, sometimes, but we very rarely have a regulatory book. So in this case, the EPA has to resort to the Civil Rights Act, Title VI. And I'll give an example. General Iron is an example of that. Now, Reverend Johnson mentioned something about General Iron. This is a picture of General Iron. It's in Lincoln Park. And there have been many, many articles written about General Iron. And I picked the Chicago Tribune. There's lots of news sources. The Chicago Tribune, I've been following their environmental reporting for many years. One of their lead environmental reporters, his name is Michael Hawthorne, and he wrote many, many articles about General Iron, blasting this company for odors and noise complaints, etc., and the violations, some of which my folks sent out to them. Can you guess where Michael Hawthorne lives?
Lincoln Park.
He lives in Lincoln Park, that's right. So a lot of those articles that he wrote caused a lot of pressure for the company. The pressure led to this company wanting to move to South Chicago, to a red line area, predominantly Latinx neighborhood. These are some headlines. I'm not going to go through a lot of the history because Reverend Johnson talked about this. I will say that she mentioned that the saga continues. That is true, and what she may not have mentioned is that there is currently a civil rights complaint against General Iron, and that's the legal hook that we have to go after a new source that is current, that it will be emitting pollution, maybe at permanent levels, but it will the cumulative impact of those emissions is not going to be good for that neighborhood, and so. So the city of Chicago and Illinois EPA are initiating a civil rights suit. How does that work? The civil rights statute, if I can find it here. Okay. It states that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Okay. So that's the hook. The money that Illinois EPA and the city of Chicago use to protect the environment come from my office, Region 5, EPA. And so those are federal funds And so they're filing a Civil Rights Act case against General Iron. Now, General Iron has a new name now, but you can still find it because it's later called the Tourism. This is something that we're going to be following very closely. As Reverend Johnson said, they did lose a case recently, and they did initially provide a permit, and the court ruled that that permit is still good. Another case that I want to talk about is there was an excellent article in The Intercept in February 24, 2019. It was called "A Tale of Two Toxic Cities," and this was an article that really hit close to what I was working on at the time, which was ethylene oxide. And this was around 2018. What happened was that the Environmental Protection Agency does a fair amount of research on the health effects of various chemicals. And they had recently determined at that time that ethylene oxide was several-fold times more toxic than previously thought. It was a stronger carcinogen that they had been previous studies had found. And as a result of that finding, we have discovered that many neighborhoods were now unsafe, breathing unsafe levels of ethylene oxide, whereas before we didn't. That health assessment had been done with a different risk tolerance, and so my office decided to investigate the highest source in Region 5, which was in Willowbrook, Illinois. And for those of you who are watching the news back in 2018, there was a lot of stories about this Sterigenics source. And we had been in communication with Sterigenics. This is a company that sterilizes medical equipment and spices with ethylene oxide. It basically kills all of the bacteria on that equipment. And it was in a relatively affluent white neighborhood. The neighborhood included reporters. It included lawyers, scientists. There was an NFL star player who lived there. Mostly well-educated folks. After 2 years or a year and a half of very strong lobbying from this community, Sterigenics, the pressure was so strong, it included from the governor. It was part of the governor's race. And Sterigenics eventually shut down in 2019. This is what can happen when a neighborhood is very strongly active, proactive. They demonstrated in front of the company so that trucks couldn't get in and out. They laid down in front of the driveway, and they did this 24/7. And they also lobbied with their Congress representatives in Congress, and as I mentioned, it became an issue for the governor's race. This is in contrast to Cancer Alley, again, another area that Reverend Johnson talked about. This is St. John Parish in Louisiana. Cancer Alley had the highest source of ethylene oxide in the country, by far. It was much higher than Millwood. Cancer Alley in St. John Parish is an environmental justice area, actually one of the worst in the country. Actually, it is the worst in the country. It has low income, predominantly black, and it not only is the highest risk of ethylene oxide, it's the highest risk of chloroquine, a whole bunch of other chemicals. What happened in St. John Parish? Nothing. Nothing happened in St. John Parish. This was the story of environmental justice, injustice. This gives a chart. This gives a plot of, this is just chloroquine, ethylene oxide, formaldehyde. So it adds those up in a bar graph, and all of the red is St. John Parish. And they basically have the highest emissions of those sources anywhere in the country. This is Willowbrook, DuPage County over here down here. So, I work in Region 6. Dallas is not my office. I work in Chicago. So, I was the air director at the time, and so my jurisdiction is in the Chicago area. So we picked the highest source. I'm sorry, Minnesota to Ohio. We picked the highest source in Region 5, which was Willowbrook. If I was in Dallas, I would have picked St. John Parish, but I was not the air director in Dallas. I was the air director in Chicago. That's why this exploded in the press, and all the activity that was going on in St. John Parish did not. Now, this is a quote from Robert Taylor, which I will read. He's the founder of Concerned Citizens of St. John, a community action group. They looked at this community and did like they normally do. If we find a place where it's just going to be Negroes, we can set up business there, we can set up shop, because nobody cares about that. That's what Robert Taylor in Answer Out.
Do you happen to know if the Harris, Texas is the 5th Ward in Houston, or is that actually a community called Harris, Texas?
I don't.
I can look it up later, I just thought you might know.
You can probably Google it.
Okay, because if those are counties or parishes, I bet you the one in Texas is the 5th Ward.
Yeah, they're counties.
Okay, yeah, it's Harris County, it's probably the 5th Ward, or what we would call the 5th Ward.
So these numbers have gone down, and we have done action in St. John Parish since this article was written. The Environmental Justice Corps for the Administrator Region, St. John Parish was part of it, and we currently have a Clean Air Act 303 action against these sources in St. John Parish. I think the Clean Air Act 303 is an imminent and substantial endangerment, and it's frankly about time that the EPA did something about these sources.
Okay.
However, back in 2019, when this article was written, there wasn't a lot that was going on. So what can you all do? What can we do as citizens to help minimize environmental injustice? Well, knowledge is power. That's a lot of what I'm going to talk about. And regulations can be confusing, and there are, however, many opportunities for the public to comment on regulations, including permits. What's really important that a lot of people don't put enough stock in is zoning laws. And if something is zoned for residence or for industry, and there are various levels of zoning for each area.
Yeah, so I would just clarify for me, the local, let's say the county level planning commission has the power to say, well, we have too many of this kind of factory in this one place.
That's right.
But the problem might be that they don't know what's a good factory and what's a bad factory. I mean, the environmental information that they need to have to regulate it. Because what you said, you can't really decide that at the national level.
Right. And that's so important, because by the time it gets to us, it's already gone through zoning, it's gone through initial permit review, so all of those things. So we're kind of at the tail end, and we see these permits, and the company's already ready to go. They have shovels, and they're ready to go. So that's, zoning is where it happens first. And so if you're active, as they say, all politics is local. And so if you're active in that, you can determine, well, you can ask the company, and the mayor can ask the company, what do you make? What do you emit? What kind of pollution do you emit? How do you emit pollution? And if there's already enough sources, then that mayor should be making those kinds of decisions. Now, these businesses tend to provide a lot of tax dollars to the neighborhood, and they tend to provide a lot of jobs. And so there's this balancing between economic growth and pollution. And so that struggle between those two factors affects every community across the country. So knowledge is power, and the issue that a lot of environmental justice neighborhoods have is that they are, the folks who live in those neighborhoods are often poverty-stricken. And when folks are poverty-stricken, reading a permit is not the top on your priority list of things that you need to do. Oftentimes you're struggling to figure out whether you're going to pay for your rent or food or healthcare or what have you. And so these decisions are more critical. And so what we find is that in environmental justice neighborhoods, the citizens of that neighborhood don't have the time to stand out in front of a company with signs and march back and forth and do that all day. So that's something that is that folks who have come from more privilege, such as some of us, or many of us in Oak Park, that is something where we can't help. The permits can be reviewed. The folks who are best at reviewing permits are lawyers and folks with technical backgrounds, engineering type of background, or geology, or some technical field, because they typically have language that is very thick with technical details and legal language. And so those are two skills that are often important. Also, if you're in the health profession, that can also help in terms of, because you know what the toxicity can do to people. There's also a stage of review called NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. Before any construction takes place, they determine what the environmental impacts of that construction is, whether it's a road or a building or what have you, and they determine what the impact of that will be for that neighborhood. And for that NEPA review, concerned citizens can say, hey, have you done a cumulative impact analysis? And typically, no. Cumulative impact analysis is very rare. There are also...
Excuse me, that's supposed to be part of the process.
No, it isn't. No, it usually is not. Cumulative impact analysis, as I mentioned, is not something that the environmental groups have hook for. And so because there's no regulatory hook for it, it's not required. So it's one of those nice to know things for public consumption. Now, there are many research for pollution sources. There's the National Air Toxics Assessment as well as the Toxic Release Inventory. These are EPA databases. They are connected to maps, so you can actually look up your neighborhood and what are the nearest toxic sources and what are the air toxics involved near there. And for example, ethylene oxide is on this data. And so this will show you are there other sources nearby, and you can look up all the sources that are in our database, permitted, that are around a certain neighborhood. And so that is a very rich data source. We also have EJ Screen, which just on a different slide. And then you can also do FOIA. FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act, and you could request information from any government agency, whether it's city, state, or federal, and they must provide documents as long as it is not confidential information. Those documents can be provided, even if it has to be redacted. And so FOIA is a rich source of information that newspapers use all the time, and they get information from us. NGOs also FOIA EPA for documents. You can also give be an ally, as I mentioned. You can donate your time. If you're a lawyer in the medical profession, you have technical skills. If you're a good writer, a lot of these communities need. There are grants often available for a lot of these communities. Right now, the Biden administration has set aside hundreds of millions of dollars in environmental justice grants, community grants. And so, if you're a good grant writer, you can get grants for these communities. Oftentimes, that's some of their most challenging things to help people write good grants, good grant proposals.
Help me understand what a grant for environmental justice would look like.
So one example is one that we have right now in East Chicago, which is in Indiana, northwest Indiana. There is it's near the USS Lead facility there, which was in cumulative impact analysis for East Chicago. And so for this one, it was a very simple request, so it was a very short grant application. But they got $200,000 to do a grant for a cumulative impact analysis for that East Chicago neighborhood. And there's a source there that reconditions barrels, and they've been working on permit renewal, and basically they've had a lot of violations there, and they're trying to say, well, all of these cumulative emissions are causing harm to this neighborhood. Let's bring the emissions down. And so there's never been a cumulative impact analysis done in East Chicago, and so this will be really interesting to see. And so that money is being used to pay a contractor, which will do that analysis, and we are managing that contract in the EPA for this community.
So the grant comes to the EPA, or comes to?
The grant comes from, it is appropriated by Congress, it comes to us in this particular case. There are many different types of grants. In this case, it comes to the EPA. We have more, this specific grant, we have a lot more flexibility, and so we're able to pay a contractor directly once the community asks us to do this, but they have to make that written request, and then they can, and then we can use that money to do this cumulative impact analysis. So that's just one example. Yeah, here it is. East Chicago Calumet Coalition Community Advisory Group, ECC-CAG. And there are also a number of NGOs in place. This is Reverend Johnson's, put that up top there. Southland Environmental Task Force, Natural Resources Defense Council. You can get involved in any of these NGOs. You can donate money. These are local community groups. Little Village is El Viejo is a Latino community, and there's all sorts of. Once you start Googling this, there's a name, and you can become active in any of those and be an ally.
I have a question. Are there similar groups like in West Chicago, sort of between downtown and
Yes.
Oak Park?
Yes, I don't have a list of them right now. Yes, there aren't that many sources now in West Chicago. There are some, but not as many as there used to be. They're more down further south by the sanitary line, which is southwest Chicago. And so the communities are much more active in South Chicago. The little, there's Little Village, and then there's the Pullman neighborhood. So there's all sorts of active communities there. This is a picture of Robert Taylor from the Citizens of St. John Parish, and this is a community group meeting that in 2018 on my Fleabag side. So, any questions?
This is rather far-fetched, not in fact maybe fantasy, but what about requiring the owner or the CEO of one of these companies to live in that neighborhood?
Yeah. Yes, that's a great question.
Poetic justice.
Oftentimes, we do find employees of companies living near the source, because that's where they get their jobs. The companies are put there, they're promised jobs for the neighborhood, and they get their jobs. And oftentimes, one of the reasons why the neighborhoods, and this will occur in EJ or non-EJ areas, one of the time, because they're a major source of employment for that neighborhood, the people in that neighborhood are less likely to demonstrate or have activity that will lead to some that will threaten their jobs. And so we find that to be a bit of a chilling effect. And the more jobs that company creates for that neighborhood, the less that neighborhood is likely to want to fight with that company. I've been in places where neighbors are fighting with each other because of the difference of opinion. We have people going to the press anonymously because they used to work there, And when we do have public meetings and the owners are up there in those public meetings, that is one question that is always asked. Would you live here? To the owner of the company. Would you buy my house? My housing values are going down because of your company. Would you live here? And the owners of the company are just, you know, it's a good philosophy. I don't know now if you're philosophy. It's a good philosophy, but yes.
I just want to mention that my niece works for DuPont, has had 3 types of cancer, and she's not going after them, they're her job, you know? So it's hard, but
She lives on site at a chemical
no, she
factory.
does not, but she worked in their test plots when she was in college in North Dakota.
I see.
So, but she started there, she started in the chemistry, working with their, what they were, you know, so she's not anymore, she's in the business section, but, she doesn't live there, but she works in Wilmington.
Right.
So,
Yeah, these class action lawsuits are difficult for a community that says that we have a lot of cancer in this neighborhood and we'd like to sue this source, which is what happened in Sturgeon. That community has to prove that the cancer rate that is occurring in that community is higher than the county average or the state average. And we did that health analysis in Sturgeon. We asked the CDC to come in and do that health analysis, and frankly, it wasn't that much higher in that area. But the data that they use is kind of coarse, and it covers, you know, many miles out. And honestly, the area that was at risk around Sturgeon was really only about a mile, maybe 2. It's really not much beyond a mile because ethylene oxide dissipates very quickly in the air. And so the CDC study went beyond the mile, so that dilutes the data a little bit, and they understand that that's kind of a limitation of their cancer study. But that class action lawsuit, if they can't show that the cancer rates are higher than the background, then that's going to be an issue for the class action lawsuit. But in any case, it's really interesting from a health. If you're in the health field, if you're in public health, there is no way that you can prove that my cancer came from this source. You can only you can't prove causality. You can only show correlation. And so you see case after case of this, like in Erin Brockovich, which is one of my favorite environmental movies. There, it was well above the background levels, and so they were able to win that class action lawsuit. And so there's many examples of that currently throughout history. And the PFAS one is called alcohol or something like that.
The companies can always hire paid scientists to cast doubt on the issue of correlation.
Yes.
And
they do.
They do, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to deal with that.
That's right. But you can win. There are lots of cases where the community has one. Usually when it's the cases are so much higher than background. And you can see the effect as you go further out. The cases start diminishing, and so you have this. You can pinpoint the source from looking out from the source.
So you're currently now in land rather than air?
Yes, I was in air pollution for 20 years, and now I do land pollution, so toxic emissions and cleanups. Not Superfund, but cleanups that are like Superfund. And Superfund gets all the news because they're the biggest sites in the country, but there are many, many, many more cleanups that are not Superfund that need to be cleaned up. I work on those sites.
And so you work with some local organizations that are doing that? Because my friend started Delta. I don't know if you're working with them, but
That's a consulting company?
they actually, that does the cleanup.
Yes, I think that's one of the state's contractors, yeah.
down pretty quick. Yeah, so I just had a question, if you had any update on Flint, Michigan. I know that's maybe a different district, but you were there before, but.
Yeah, Flint is still an issue that we deal with every day in EPA Region 5. It has given our agency PTSD. Michigan's environmental agency also has quite a bit of PTSD from it. There were some Michigan employees who were criminally indicted. They were recently found innocent of that, but it must have been tremendous stress for those families. Flint is, of course, one of the quintessential NJ stories. One of the things that that the EPA has done recently is that Congress and President Biden have put billions of dollars into replacing the lead infrastructure in this country. So you can see that work even here in Oak Park. And so a lot of these communities are getting their lead service line replaced, and that is a really good, positive sign for the future, including environmental justice areas. It's something that President Biden signed the Justice 40 initiative. So that means that 40%, at least 40% of those lead replacement lines are occurring in BJ areas, at least. And so that is something that where our federal dollars are going to help communities in need right now. And I think it was one of the first communities to get that. That is, these issues pop up. Benton Harbor had lead in their water a few years ago. We would talk about that every day in meetings, even though it's not my field of water, but it comes up. There's communities in Alabama, I think, that had some huge water lead issues. So they pop up every once in a while, and it's a problem that needs to be fixed. Regardless of the fear, it's a justified fear about lead in drinking water. And if you have a lead service line, I would recommend you use one of those filters, either reverse osmosis under the sink or put one directly onto your faucet. That's what I use it on. It is a significant concern. However, the number one cause of lead exposure in America is through lead paint in the house. And Oak Park has a lot of really old homes, and it has a fair amount of lead paint. But good question. Thank you. And you've been an excellent audience. I really appreciate all of your excellent questions. And I will give you my slides when after this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to ask one more thing. If you would, in response to Karen's question about some of the organizations that might be on the west side,
Yes.
if you have some list, if you could send those to me.
Yeah.
Because we're more apt to be able to really do something as allies.
In partnership there.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah.